The North American crash may be one of the most important events in the history of gaming, but it is still one that can often be misunderstood or misinterpreted. The various markets for computers, consoles and arcades were affected to different degrees, but it's the arcade where this story is based on because, well, while a lot of games companies did manage to make their way through the crash, beaten up but not finished, there are some that didn't. And that includes a name that wasn't just responsible for video games, but was one of the most historic, visible and reputable brand names in amusements for over 50 years. However, years of struggle, takeovers, name changes, and ultimately the crash itself pushed them over the edge and eventually out. And that name is Gottlieb. A pre-war company with a whole lot of history where video games plays a part, but that part comes pretty close to the end. This is what we're concentrating on, of course, and it will feature a couple of very famous titles indeed, as well as some much more obscure and even unreleased ones, not to mention a big merger with a massive company that you may not have expected would ever be directly involved in video gaming, but they were for an incredibly short period. We will get to all that, but this needs to start with a fair bit of background. To understand Gottlieb's history, you have to go far beyond video games and head deep into the world of pinball. That is, without question, where they were a dominant force. Founded in 1927 in Chicago by David Gottlieb, the company was entirely a family operation for 50 years, and they were at the forefront of the rise of mechanical pinball games and later electromechanical pinball games from the 1930s onwards, starting with a 1931 game called Baffle Ball. This may look pretty different from how you would expect a pinball game to look. There were no flippers back then, just a spring launcher to fire those balls up into the machine and score points with. Basically an updated version of Bagatelle, the 18th century French game that pinball originated from. Flippers came in 1947, and that was thanks to Gottlieb. Humpty Dumpty was the first pin to include them, and that was the creation of a man named Harry Mabs. The first of arguably 3 all-time great designers that headed up the company's pinball division. There were plenty more, but there are 3 gods amongst men, so to speak. The flipper is clearly a pretty game-changing addition to the world of pinball, and Harry is also credited with the creation of swinging targets and disappearing bumpers, or pop bumpers that retract into the machine when they're hit. These last 2 innovations happened after Harry Mabs left Gottlieb in the early 1950s to join fellow Chicago pinball makers Williams, but the flippers happened when he was at Gottlieb. That said, you may notice those flippers face inward, and they aren't at the bottom. The more traditional placement of flippers, placed at the bottom, is credited to Steve Kordek, who put them there for the 1948 Genko table Triple Action. After Harry Mabs left for Williams, the mantle at Gottlieb was taken by Wayne Neyes, a man who would be part of Gottlieb's setup over the course of 5 decades, designing over 175 machines and doing plenty more innovating along the way. Neyes was the first to design a multiplayer pinball machine, as well as the first to trademark the add a ball concept. This allows players to win extra balls on the field, usually in the form of a multi-ball, and it was mainly used as a way to sell pins in states such as Texas, where winning extra credits on pinball tables was outlawed. That may seem outrageous, but as we'll see, it's nothing compared to the perception of pinball in other areas of the states at the time. Neyes was a colossal figure in pinball's history, and was one of the longest surviving links to that history in America. He lived until the ripe age of 104, passing away in 2022, and was actively a part of the pinball scene until pretty close to the end. Following Neyes, the third of Gottlieb's utterly elite designers would be a man named Ed Krynski, who started with Gottlieb in 1965. Krynski designed over 200 machines, and the amount of innovations he was responsible for? Countless. Flipper laneways, carousel targets, vary targets, multiple drop targets, solid-state machines with the speaker in the back box. All of these innovations are credited to Ed Krynski. These 3 designers, Mabs, Neyes and Krynski, were all mavericks, all legendary to a point that words can't even really do justice to. Without them, pinball machines as we know them would be completely unrecognisable, and they made Gottlieb the leading name in the industry. For a long time, a Gottlieb table could be sold to operators simply with a name. Not even a design was required, their quality was so consistent. Now admittedly, pinball is not a strong point of mine, as I am admittedly terrible at it, but it doesn't take much to recognise truly great work, and hundreds of the tables that these people made are beautiful works of art, embodiments of the time they were made in, a vivid link to an earlier America. As Gottlieb's old slogan went, these machines were as American as baseball and hot dogs. Just a quick interruption to talk about my book, Arcade Decades. The Kickstarter campaign's still going strong, we've passed the goal for the audiobook and heading towards hidden treasures and more. There'll definitely be a couple of Gottliebs in that section, for sure. If you're interested in an arcade book featuring over 100 games and all original photography, the link is in the description. Thank you, and back to the vid. We're jumping over now to the mid-late 1970s. We're still not into the world of video games yet, but it's important to cover the background that would cause Gottlieb to start making their way into that world. In 1976, Wayne Neyes designed his final pinball table, Spirit of 76, with Ed Krynski. This bicentennial themed pin was a highly acclaimed and very successful table, one that Neyes predicted would shift over 10,000 units. And it did that, becoming one of the most successful tables in Gottlieb's history. It does feel a bit like the end of an era in many ways, and not just because it's Neyes' last table. This was a time when pinball was finally becoming perceived as a legitimate game. In pinball history, the period between 1948 and 1958 is largely regarded as the golden age of pinball due to the advances that happened in the game during that time. But both for that period, and indeed far beyond it, amazingly, pinball was actually illegal in a lot of places in the US. That's something people would have a hard time believing today. Pinball is thought of as such a wholesome thing, a classic slice of Americana. But in those days, it was thought of as anything but. The major crackdown on pinball started during the Second World War in New York City, spearheaded by then Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. LaGuardia argued against pinball on several fronts. First off, that it was connected to the mob, who used the machines as part of their shakedown rackets. Now, it would be hard to deny that there were connections between pinball machines and organised crime, at least on operator levels in some parts, but this wasn't really the true motivation behind the ban. That was much more of a moral issue for people like LaGuardia. Pinball was seen as a gateway to lead young children to gambling, moral corruption, juvenile delinquency, and, yes, organised crime, taking the nickels and pennies they had for lunch money and using them to become hooked on a form of gambling before they were even out of school. Because after all, pinball was back then largely perceived as a game of chance, not a game of skill. In the end, the US's entry into World War II gave LaGuardia the ammunition, both metaphorically and in the end, literally, to succeed in his quest. Post-Pearl Harbor, he argued that the materials used to make these evil and corrupting machines should instead be used to make bullets, shells and bombs for the war effort. This was enough for the ban to be approved in NYC, and for LaGuardia to pose with all the machines that were then seized over a brutal crackdown, taking a sledgehammer to them before they were recycled and turned into ammo. Many other major cities followed suit over the next few years with an outright ban. Even Chicago, where most of the pinball companies were located, banned pinball. San Francisco was perhaps the only major city that didn't ban it or otherwise heavily prohibit it. And so pinball was, for over 3 decades, largely driven underground, associated with rebellious streaks and outright criminal activity. It was the mid-1970s when things finally changed and pinball became much more accepted nationwide. Roger Sharp, a writer and highly skilled pinball player, was able to demonstrate to the Manhattan City Council that pinball was not a game of luck, but a game of skill, playing a table and calling his shots Babe Ruth style. This worked, and the bans on pinball were finally lifted. Amazing, isn't it? Again, it's something that a lot of people would find staggeringly hard to believe nowadays, but it's completely true. With the legitimacy of pinball now largely not in doubt, aside from a few ultra-moralistic cranks and grouchers, the mid to late 1970s was also a time when pinball tables themselves were, once again, changing. This was a time when the pinball industry was making a switch from electromechanical tables to solid-state tables, machines that were one-off of computer chips and were, theoretically, less prone to failure. The first of these machines came out in 1975 from a rather obscure company named M.A.C.H. Coincidentally, this table was also named Spirit of 76. However, it would be Gottlieb's rivals in Chicago, Williams, who would really grasp the nettle when it came to the new form. 1977's hot tip was Williams's first solid-state pin, and it represented a commercial breakthrough for solid-state. These machines were noisy enough and busy enough to replicate the feeling of an electromechanical table, a purposeful decision by the designers at Williams who wanted to stop these circuitry-based machines from feeling more cold and impersonal. Bally, another Chicago-based company formed in 1931, would also get a huge foothold in the solid-state world, becoming an industry leader. On the other hand, Gottlieb struggled with the transition from electromechanical to solid state. They made the initial mistake of believing that solid state was going to be a fad. They were then very late to the party when it came to making the transition over to solid state, and a lot of their solid state tables just weren't able to make the same impression as those from Williams, Bally, or another new Chicago outfit named Stern, largely formed in 1977 through buying the ashes of the defunct pinball makers Chicago Coin and later Seeburg, the jukebox makers who had at one point owned Williams. It was during this time as well that Gottlieb stopped being simply a family-owned private business. In 1976, they were acquired by Columbia Pictures for $47 million. One upshot of this was that Gottlieb could now quite easily make licensed tables, a few of which were indeed pretty successful. Sinbad, their second solid-state machine from 1978, based on the film Sinbad and the Eye of Tiger, was another one of the most popular machines in their history, with around 12,000 units manufactured. There were other licensed efforts though, such as Charlie's Angels and James Bond, that may have been manufactured in pretty large numbers, but aren't exactly well-loved machines to say the least, while a lot of the more regular unlicensed machines, with some exceptions such as 1981's highly acclaimed Black Hole and the stunning Haunted House from 1982, the first pinball table with 3 separate playfields, weren't exactly setting the floor on fire. A lot of them were part of a solid-state line called System 80 that could produce good machines, but also by all accounts produced very temperamental machines that needed a whole lot of maintenance and repair, which somewhat irked operators. That and folks such as Ed Krynski weren't getting any younger, were thinking about retirement, and were also getting disillusioned at the more corporate, money-centric atmosphere that existed at Gottlieb following the Columbia acquisition. More than anything else, as we get further into the 1980s, pinball as a whole was struggling to get attention. Video games were the big new attraction, and unfortunately what is seen as the golden age for arcade games was thought of as more of a dark age for pinball. In 1980, Gottlieb's then boss, an executive named Bob Bloom who had no prior amusement experience, was coy when the subject of Gottlieb moving into arcade games was broached, eventually coming out with a maybe. It wouldn't take much longer after this for the question to be answered properly. Other previously pinball-centric companies, such as Stern, Williams and Bally, now Bally Midway following a merger, had all started making arcade games already, and they'd all hit the ground running. Stern made Berserk, Williams made Defender, Midway licensed Pac-Man from Namco. Their decision to move into the video game business was paying dividends, and Gottlieb, well, they were already playing catch-up, still struggling to adapt. Late 1980 did see them dip their toes into the pool, but this was in the form of licensing. They threw 2 Japanese games at the wall to see if they would stick. The first was No Man's Land, a Universal game that was originally known as Sengoku no Jietai. This is a pretty average top-down tank game where you get more points if you're able to make your way up the playfield and take out the tanks before they leave their pens, but it's not exactly on the same level as, say, Namco's Tank Battalion. The second was a game called New York, New York by Sigma. This is a Galaxian-esque title where you gain the most points by taking out a black hole that the enemy ships surround, killing them off in a single blow. Again, it's pretty meh, and that Statue of Liberty just gets in the way. Neither of these titles were in any way impressive, and they certainly didn't make any waves on the arcade floor. And so Gottlieb largely decided that licensing games from Japan wasn't for them, although they would try it again in 1983 when they went for Konami's Juno First. Juno First is obviously a much superior game to these two earlier efforts in every possible way, but this came out in September of 1983, and much like the previous two titles, it didn't end up being much of a success in the States. "1981, again, saw frustratingly slow movement from Gottlieb on the video game front. It's clear that they needed to get things moving and set up their own division for designing and making games, but it took time for this to actually happen, for the manufacturing facilities and division to be built up, and then staffed with people to head it up, folks such as Howie Rubin, Bill Jacobs, and Ron Waxman. Bob Bloom, he of the maybes to the video game question, is out as president by the end of 1981, replaced by Boyd Brown. Although again, this is basically just another executive with general management and marketing experience, as opposed to anything directly relevant to arcade operation. It should be said that people who have a great love for Gottlieb's pinball machines do possibly have pictures of these two reserved for use on their dartboards, so that tells you how popular their decisions were with pin fans. Some early ideas and prototypes are made, but they don't get anywhere. Quasimodo, for example, was a monochrome trivia game for which not much detail exists, although Jeff Lee did design this character here for the title, who does look a bit Lemon-esque. The character was very cute, but the game itself was a non-starter. The hardware for the game was some sort of arcadified Apple II, and it couldn't handle the game at all. A couple of machines may possibly still exist somewhere, but the game remains undumped. Another non-starter comes in the form of a game originally known as Video Man, then Protector, also Why Me, and then finally Argus. This is something a bit more meaty, seeing as we can actually play the thing. This was largely worked on by Tom Malinkowski and Warren Davis, with David Thiel on sound and Jeffrey Lee on graphics. We'll be seeing these names a fair bit. Here you use a trackball to control a Superman-esque hero who must protect citizens on the ground from aliens who wish to take them up and capture them, or otherwise kill them via falling rubble, shocking rods, or other such items. Our hero can shoot these guys down and can also grab things. He must either grab fallen citizens, or vehicles that can also be captured, or the aforementioned rubble. If the number of citizens drops to 0, the game's over. Tom did want Gottlieb to try and get an official Superman license for this game, but that didn't happen. I do find it interesting that this is a Superman game where our hero actually is invincible, where survival in the game is measured by how he performs the task at hand, as opposed to whether he can dodge an alien's shots. The concept is cool, but the controls are quite dodgy, and that's why the game didn't test well at all. People thought that the trackball was messing up when they were playing it, but it was just the way the game was designed. In the end, this game wouldn't get a release, although the archives for the game do give this rather amusing and unflattering Jeff Lee creation, an alternative version of the superhero that is apparently based on the aforementioned new Vice President of Engineering, Ron Waxman. Another game that could have possibly been Gottlieb's first video game was Gridley. This one was made by a small company named Videa, founded by ex-Atari folk, and programmed by Ed Rotberg of Battlezone fame. Initially it had the working title of Pogos. The idea here is that you control this little creature named Gridley with a trackball and pick up the bouncing balls, while also shooting down the enemy pogo sticks that bounce around the grid, electrifying sections of it as they go. It's a simple little idea, but honestly I can't say I'm a huge fan of the game. It's hard to judge where anything's actually going. Again, this did not perform well in testing, and Gottlieb decided to pass on it. While this game wouldn't ever be released in any form, Videa was soon acquired by Nolan Bushnell's Pizza Time Theatre, aka Chuck E. Cheese. Their name would be changed to Sente, and the Gridley hardware would become the basis for the Sente arcade computer that powered most of their games. Happily, we can now start looking at titles that actually did come out. The Gridley deal showed at least that Gottlieb were negotiating with people who definitely had proven arcade pedigree, and another guy that they signed up was Tim Skelly, an independent programmer and designer who'd made his reputation through excellent and very successful vector games for Cinematronics, such as Star Castle, Rip-Off and Armour Attack. Skelly was signed up for 3 games, and Reactor would become Gottlieb's first actual arcade release in June of 1982. I do have a full video on this game already, because it is excellent. You need to cool down a nuclear reactor by bouncing subatomic particles into the walls, while avoiding being bounced into them yourself. The graphics are simple and abstract, but the sound is wonderful, particularly the rock riffs that David Field provides, and it also features a full credit for Skelly, something that he insisted on. Unfortunately, the game wasn't as successful as it should have been, with only 1,000 or so units manufactured. A big shame, and nowadays this game rightly does get a fair bit of love from Golden Age arcade enthusiasts. What about another approach that might be more fitting for Gottlieb? Why don't they try to do something that's a hybrid of sorts, a cross between pinball and video game? Well, that's what you get with Caveman, the first table that is both a pin and a video game. As you can see, there's a 13-inch CRT plonked into the playfield, and you can go up the ramps to enter the video game, which is a Pac-Man-esque affair where your hero can plonk some dinos on the head with his club, but must avoid the red tyrannosaurs. This is an intriguing hybrid, one that was also seen with Baby Pac-Man at around the same time. However, it didn't catch on. Put simply, the video game was too simplistic to appeal to video game fans, and the pinball was too simplistic to appeal to pinball fans. So it didn't please anyone, and only a couple of thousand Caveman units were manufactured. It still doesn't have a particularly good reputation nowadays, I'm afraid. As can be seen, Gottlieb's early attempts at producing arcade games tell a tale of frustration, of trying different approaches and not really finding success with any of them. Licensing Japanese games didn't work out, video game pinball hybrids didn't work out, some games just didn't test well, and another was damn good but didn't get an audience. It's a worrisome start indeed, especially as Gottlieb's profits continue to drop badly. In 1981, they lost almost half of their entire revenue. Things aren't exactly going well in the slightest, and if this shift into the arcade game business has any chance of working out, then they really need to find that big hit, even as their other pinball rivals have already firmly established themselves in the arcade market with hit games of their own. The odds seem like they're long, but, well, Gottlieb did manage to find it.
Hello, I'm Krynski.
The concept for what would become Q*bert came from Jeff Lee, who was futzing around one day, creating a pseudo 3D set of cubes in the style of M.A.C.H, and thinking that there might actually be a game in here where a large-nosed orange creature moved on said cubes, dubbing the prototype Snots and Boogers. Warren Davis, a recent hire from Bell Labs, agreed and set to work, although the actual pattern that would make up the levels in Q*bert appears to have come from a pattern of hexagons made by another of the company's designers, Kan Yamamoto. The full design would see this orange hero jump from cube to cube, changing the colour of the top of each cube as he went until a rack was completed. This crucial idea was contributed by Ron Waxman, the VP of Engineering. David Field, meanwhile, was working with a Votrax SC01A synthesizer, trying to get some speech out of it for the game. Getting recognisable sentences out of the synth proved frustrating, and Field decided to just throw random phonemes at it, generating a bunch of gibberish which somehow ended up being very appropriate for the character in question. Jeff Lee making a visual representation of the gibberish that presented it as a swear word, something for him to say whenever he was caught by another critter. And while we all know this character as Q-Bert today, the game did go through a whole bunch of names. Howie Rubin thought that the swearing should be the title of the game, but everyone else thought it would be hard to sell a game whose name couldn't be pronounced. Cubes was another working title, as was Hubert, and eventually we get a combination of the two, Q-Bert. This was then changed slightly. The Q was added in order to make sure that people didn't call a game Cupboard by mistake. The end result would be, by far, Gottlieb's most successful arcade video game. Q-Bert would shift around 25,000 units following its release in October of 1982, with the game quickly becoming highly influential and the titular character becoming one of the icons of the Golden Age. It's easy to see why, really. As simple as it may appear, Q-Bert is absolutely chock full of character. You've got the brilliantly designed main character himself, what with his swearing or Q-Bertese, and other little phrases such as "Hello, I'm turned on" when the machine is powered up, or a "bye-bye" that ends every play, as well as all the other enemies on the field, Coily the Sprin, Slick and Sam, Ugg and Ronway. It's all very lovely indeed, and it makes for a game that you want to try over and over again. There's the other really cool little touches too. A joystick that's positioned on X angles to better represent the directions that Q-Bert can move in, or a knocker solenoid that goes off whenever either Q-Bert or Coily fall off the level, producing a sound that makes you think for a second that the machine's about to blow up. A lot has been said over the years about Q-Bert, from its creators to the people who are utterly enthusiastic about it, even those who made Lord knows how many clones of the game for microcomputers and the like. It is indisputably a Golden Age classic, one of those that still resonates even now, to the point where Q-Bert is actually the classic arcade character that gets the most screen time out of anybody in Disney's Wreck-It Ralph films. It's tremendous, and it finally gave Gottlieb the big arcade hit that they were desperately looking for. Unsurprisingly, Gottlieb was quick to try and capitalise on it, aiming to make the little orange creature as big a name as Pac-Man and Donkey Kong. 1983 would see the production of quite a lot of Q-Bert merchandise. There's a Q-Bert board game, a Q-Bert lunchbox, Q-Bert t-shirts, Q-Bert plushies, Q-Bert frisbees, Q-Bert on basically anything that Gottlieb could stick him on, as well as a Q-Bert cartoon that appeared on CBS's Saturday Supercade, set in a town called Qburg, where a teenage and more humanesque Q-Bert has a girlfriend called QT, a brother called Q-Bit, friends called Q-Ball, Q-Val, and Q-Mungus, and the game's enemies act as the cartoon's bullies. Yeah, as you can imagine, the letter Q features quite a lot in the cartoon script. Possibly so much that you may want to aggressively shove a Q-tip into your ear while watching the bloody thing. Naturally, there was also a Q-Bert pinball table, Q-Bert's Quest, designed by John Trudeau. Unfortunately, this machine again wasn't a very successful one. Less than 1,000 units were manufactured, and once again it doesn't seem to be a particularly well-regarded table amongst pinball fans, although the flippers do try to replicate Q-Bert's movement, which is a neat touch. But all of this effort certainly did go some way to putting Q-Bert amongst the Golden Age's most recognisable figures, at least for a time. When the Golden Age ended, his star did fade a lot quicker than the likes of Pac-Man or Donkey Kong, although he has reclaimed a pretty decent chunk of that star power in recent years. It feels sensible to cover the other two Q-Bert games, or at least the two by Gottlieb, here before moving on to other stuff, so let's do that. We have one that didn't make it to release, and another that did. The first is an upgrade to the original that could have been released in early 1983. This is faster, harder, more challenging Q-Bert, although it's usually shortened to FHMC Q-Bert. FHMC features quite a few new features, and obviously a lot more challenge. The discs that you use to travel back up the stage now move around, there's some levels where the tiles will constantly change colour when Q-Bert steps on them, there's the appearance of another female version of Q-Bert, this time named Q-Bertha. There's quite a lot going on, and it's all really good. It may well be that some of the features in FHMC were stuff that originally got knocked out of the original game through testing, but in the end this second version didn't come out, because lots of people were still playing and learning the original, and Gottlieb, or possibly Mylstar by this time, but we'll get to that, didn't deem the update to be necessary. Either way, FHMC Q*bert didn't come out, and no units were ever manufactured, which is kind of a shame. However, Warren Davis himself released the ROM on the internet, so that it can be played by everybody, which is nice. Q*bert's Cubes is the proper sequel to the original, programmed by Neil Bernstein. Warren Davis wasn't hugely interested in making another one, but Bernstein had the idea for it. Q*bert's Cubes takes a bit of inspiration from another craze of the time, that being the Rubik's Cube. The cubes are now separated out a bit into a blown-out diamond, and they revolve based on the direction that Q*bert jumps off of them, with the aim usually being to make a tic-tac-toe line of cubes that match the set colour. The regular enemies, as well as some new ones called Meltniks, can also be taken out if they land on a cube as it's revolving. I actually like this a lot. It still retains a lot of the original's character while providing a different enough take on its gameplay. Alas, this one was for a long time pretty damn obscure. The copyright on the arcade is 1983, but no one's sure if Q*bert's Cubes was actually released then, and it seems as though whatever release there was very limited. It likely only came out as a conversion kit for the original Q*bert, and it possibly didn't arrive until sometime in 1984, right near the very end of the Gottlieb Mylstar video game journey. All that said, if you go ahead and fire this one up now, you'll likely have a good time with it, especially if you are already a Q*bert fan. It's a very neat sequel indeed. We do still have a few games to cover as it goes, a lot of loose ends to tie up. Q*bert certainly was Gottlieb's biggest hit video game, but it was not, as we shall see, their only hit. On the other side, we do have quite a few games that never saw the light of day. Hell, Gottlieb have about as many unreleased games to look at as they do actually released ones. And then, of course, we have big changes at the company, with things getting even more corporate. 1983 is another year where things get shaken up massively. Throughout the course of the previous year, there hadn't been any outward evidence at Gottlieb of the big shake-up at Columbia Pictures, their parent company. In June 1982, they had been bought for $750 million by the Coca-Cola company. Evidence of the buyout does exist in Gottlieb's biggest game, mind you. There was a special and nowadays very obscure variant of Q*bert, made in 1982, known as Mellow Yellow Q*bert, promoting Coke's citrus-based caffeine fest of the same name. You likely wouldn't have found this variation in arcades. From my understanding, Mellow Yellow Q*bert was a promotion largely aimed at street locations such as grocery stores, you know, places where the sugary drink would actually be sold. It's largely identical to the original except for a new title screen and the addition of cutscenes where Q*bert slurps a can of Mellow Yellow through his big ol' schnoz. Also, there was a competition where anyone who looped through the game 10 times and took a picture of the resulting animation could send that in and get 5 cases of Mellow Yellow in return. Nice, eh? You'll be bouncing off the walls of the arcade in no time. There is also unused art in the ROM for FHMC Q*bert that suggests it would have been a tie-in game with 7-Eleven if it had been released, with little sprites of the logo kicking around. However, nothing actually appears in the game. It's June 1983 when the big change happens. A letter to operators from President Boyd Brown says that Gottlieb are going to be changing their name, effective July the 3rd. To reflect their plans to grow in the coin-operated field, as well as expand their opportunities to enter other high-technology segments of the entertainment industry, they will change their name to Mylstar Electronics Limited, a name chosen after much consideration and research because it evokes the image of an organisation where exciting, new products are being created to meet tomorrow's entertainment needs. Yeah, it's a load of bollocks, isn't it? A big steaming load of corporate bleh. One finger snap, And there you go. 56 years of history, gone in an instant, replaced with a name that has no meaning. What the hell even is a Mylstar anyway? Warren Davis made the inside joke that if you spelt Mylstar backwards, you got rat slime, which sounds much more appropriate for that earlier spiel. For the older folks operating in the now ailing and seemingly condemned pinball division, this sort of shit was too much to take. The legendary Ed Krynski would depart just before the end of this whole debacle, with 1984's Eldorado City of Gold being his final table, in truth one based off a much older design of his, and it would take until the turn of the millennium before he reconnected with the world of pinball again. While 1982 and 1983 did see fortunes increase at Gottlieb, in no small part due to Q*bert, one may well have been able to see some dark clouds forming on the horizon. But we'll get to that. For now, we have various other games to cover. What of Tim Skelly? We've seen his first game for Gottlieb already, the excellent Reactor, and he was supposed to have two more, products which, as a freelancer, he largely worked on at his home. He did indeed have two more titles, although unfortunately neither of them got a full release. He made Insector later in 1982 and Screw Loose in 1983, but neither one could make it through testing. Both titles certainly do feature Skelly going further into his preferred single-screen grid type of gameplay, and I would say that Insector is the better of the two. The goal here is to set fire to the many bugs, eventually getting close enough to take out the queen where they spawn from, collect the various jewels, and avoid the worms that crawl around. It's similar in speed and intensity to Reactor, and another kicker is that the game can take place on multiple levels. You use bombs in order to get down to where the queen is at. A cool feature here is that you enter initials for identification at the beginning of each game, and this actually acts as a seed for the levels, so you can change these for a different experience each time, if you wish. Screw Loose is a cuter game where you have this rapidly bouncing figure with free hands who must shoot everything else on the field. If he gets shot, he loses a hand, but he can still pick it up as long as it doesn't get taken off the grid. Naturally, there's an incentive to keeping those hands around, seeing as you've clearly got more firepower if you've got all three of them. This is quite cool, although if I was to pick just one of these games to be actually released, I would definitely go for Insector. I think it's got a little bit more going for it. Also on the unreleased games front, we have Nightmare from 1983. This is kind of an odd game, still something of a work in progress in this prototype version, where you control two knights, one at the top throwing bombs and another at the bottom. You control the gates on the battlements as well, and that changes the path the bombs go in. They need to hit the dragons, ideally before they reach the knight at the top. This is a rather odd game, and one that I don't really get. Again though, this does seem to be rather far from finished, with no sound or anything like that. Kind of a weird little concept. You would have thought we would have perhaps seen more movie tie-in games from Gottlieb. They were owned by Columbia, after all, and there were the licensed pinball tables. In the end though, there are only a couple of tie-in Gottlieb games, and Krull here is the first of them. Based on the sci-fi film, Krull was actually in the arcades before the film was out in the cinema. It arrived in March of 1983. What we have here is a collection of minigames, something that's kind of similar to Midway's highly successful Tron tie-in from 1982, although they happen in fixed sequence. You play as Prince Colwyn, and first you must retrieve the pieces of your glaive while dodging the boulders, then you recruit several men to help you slay the beast, take out various slayers with those men in a battle through the swamps, open up the gate that leads into the Black Fortress, and then finally avoid the beast and save Princess Lysa. The game's not bad at all, really. The graphics are very decent, and the David Field sound effects and music are stunning. The game wasn't a hit, but that's perhaps more to do with it being stuck with what, alas, ended up being a rather big box office bomb. The Krull film was a big flop, and so naturally the game didn't do well. A rather ambitious pinball table was also designed for Krull, a 400-pound wide-bodied beast with a transparent playfield to go along with the main one. Alas, this never went into main production due to its expense, combined with the movie flopping. Only 10 or so Krull pinball machines were ever made, and the ones that do exist aren't exactly seen out in the wild that often. The very appearance of a Krull at a pinball expo, whenever it does happen, is the sort of thing that, to say the least, sets tongues wagging. Mad Planets is another released game by Gottlieb, this time by Kan Yamamoto, that falls into their more abstract works. It's another shooter, this time one where you have to take out entire planets and their moons using your spaceship, although they can be taken out quickly, before they reach full size. The control here was pretty different for the time. You've got both an oversized joystick for moving the spaceship around, and a rotary spinner for changing its orientation. It is a little tricky to get the hang of this, especially if you're playing this in MAME like I am. This would be much easier on the actual arcade machine because the fire trigger is located on the joystick. This game doesn't take long to get majorly tough. Those planets move very quickly indeed, and when it gets to the point that comets and mad moons start appearing, you're really going to need to be on the ball. Still, there are some major positives. Once again, David Feel's music and SFX really do shine. Feel is the unsung hero of a lot of these Gottlieb games, it must be said. His work is incredible. I would say it has a similar impact to what you would find in Williams's games, but there's a bit more control in Feel's work, as opposed to the absolute chaos of Williams, although both of their approaches end up with fantastic results. Again, this wasn't really a hit with only 1,500 or so machines ever produced, but it's definitely worth a little look. Next up, we do have the other big hit video game from Gottlieb. Not one that's too well remembered nowadays, but it is one of the best of a kind of game that, for a time, was all the rage. M.A.C.H takes us flying into Laserdisc land, the big craze that kickstarted with Dragon's Lair in June of 1983, and was for a time a big shot in the arm for arcades that were slowly starting to feel the pinch a little. M.A.C.H represented an approach to Laserdisc gaming that hadn't really been seen yet, a more traditional shooter overlaid onto the filmed footage, and in this instance, it happens to work very well. You get two different modes in M.A.C.H, a fighter mode where you're behind the plane, using your guns and firing missiles at targets, and a bomber mode that's top-down, where you're hitting targets on the ground. The gameplay is definitely helped along by the speedy and expertly shot footage, and again there's a lot of big sound going on. That sort of thing goes a long way, and makes this a much different experience to something far more simplistic like, say, Sega's Astron Belt. The footage itself is the work of legendary pilot and aerial cinematographer Clay Lacey, using his Astrovision setup with cameras mounted on the top and bottom of an aeroplane's fuselage. Funnily enough, the footage that Lacey shot for the film Firefox would also be used for Atari's tie-in Laserdisc game for that movie, but said game was quite the failure. M.A.C.H, on the other hand, was a big success with around 5,600 units shipped, a fine number for a pretty damn expensive cabinet, and it is Gottlieb's biggest video game hit outside of Q*bert. The success of M.A.C.H naturally pushed Gottlieb further down the Laserdisc road. They've secured a big hit, and now they've got a chance to go even bigger with their next Laserdisc title. And go big they certainly would. Their second Laserdisc game, Us vs. Them, is quite the ambitious one. The design of the game was done by Warren Davis, but the concept was actually by Dennis Nordman, who'd come over from Bally where he'd been designing pinball tables, although his job at Gottlieb was based around creating video game concepts. The general concept was of a B-movie where you battled with aliens over all sorts of big landmarks such as Mount Rushmore and the Statue of Liberty, complete with lots of cutaways to actors or to UFOs firing at you and things like that. Some details of Nordman's concept was pared down a little, but the general idea remained through development. And honestly, The end result is one of the most entertaining and best of all the Laserdisc games. Us vs Lem features all sorts of appropriate cheesiness, with tremendously over-the-top acting during the cutscenes that introduce each level, room for the odd little cutaway to somebody screaming during levels, and cheeky little references. Davis is inserted into the game as the green fighter pilot, Mellow Yellow is a code for another one, and there's a General Waxman who acts as a typically dumb and evil boss of the operation. The cheesy Laserdisc action is certainly fun to see, and it's clear that a lot of effort and money went into that, filled as it is with appropriate sets, computer graphics, plenty more footage captured up in the air, and so on. But the actual game itself is a lot of fun. The key to Us vs Lem is that most levels do tend to change up the action. Sometimes you're behind the ship, sometimes you've got a side-on stage, next you're rushing through a forest and trying to dodge trees in a sequence that was naturally inspired by Return of the Jedi, or you're going deep into the mothership and trying to make your way through the hole-in-the-wall type energy barriers. There's a lot going on that keeps the play fresh, not repetitive like so many other Laserdisc games, and the overwrought plot offers even more reason to keep going. The sound here is amazing too. Dave Zabriskie was in charge of this, and not only do you have the usual sound effects that you would expect from a Gottlieb arcade, you've got a full orchestral score. As much as a lot of Laserdisc titles from this age get a bad rap, Us vs Lem is clearly amongst the very best of them. The team behind it went all out to make something really damn good, and they absolutely did. Well, it failed. It failed miserably. Us vs Lem was sold as a conversion kit for existing M.A.C.H machines, and it arrived in June 1984. By this time, the Laserdisc bubble had unfortunately burst, and more than that, the North American video game crash was in full swing. Also, a lot of distributors who had ordered M.A.C.H cabs for 1984 were now suddenly refusing to take and pay for said cabs. This in particular saw Mylstar file a lawsuit in April of 1984 against Bally, claiming that they had unlawfully cancelled the orders on 343 M.A.C.H cabs, machines that distributors were, according to Playmeter, now selling at over 25% less than the initial $4,000 price tag that Mylstar had initially put on them for distributors. This is, as you can probably guess, going to be a gigantic blow. As you can imagine, Us vs Lem was barely seen in any arcades at all. It remains a very obscure game indeed. Now, some people have posited that this crash didn't really affect arcades, that it was just limited to the home. Nothing could be further from the truth. 1983 had already been a very bad year. US Industry Mag Playmeter's November State of the Industry survey revealed that around $2.5 billion, or 10 million quarters, in total revenue had been lost by operators across the land. It had gone from 8.9 billion to 6.4 billion, resulting in the closure of around 2,000 locations. Video games didn't exactly fare a whole lot better in 1984. Total revenue in North American arcades for video games was 4.36 billion in 1982, it dropped hugely to 2.9 billion in 1983, and then again in 1984 to 2.5 billion, with Playmeter measuring the total revenue for operators in 1984 at 4.5 billion, another huge loss. However, this loss was tempered, at least a little, by an increase in revenue for other amusements. Pinball started reclaiming lost ground, as did things like jukeboxes, slot machines, and pool tables. This spells better news for street locations than it does for arcades, mind you, an arcade being defined by Playmeter as any location that has 10 or more arcade games. For those locations, times were tough, and many were shut down. Again, these stats come from contemporary trade papers compiled by the excellent blogger, the Golden Age Arcade Historian, but they paint a very miserable picture. And for some companies, this sort of loss was too much to take. Partly due to the major depression in the North American arcade market, and in more detail due to the huge commercial failure of Us vs Lem and the disastrous refusal of the M.A.C.H cabs, the sights of the Coca-Cola company were set on Mylstar, and the results weren't going to be pleasant. There was a brief section of time during which a couple of other games were released out into the arcades, we'll look at these in a bit, but on September 23rd of 1984, Coca-Cola and Columbia pulled the plug. Mylstar Electronics, and by extension Gottlieb, was over, marking the end of a company that had been running for 57 years. Or, at the very least, the video game side was most certainly over and done with. A group led by a Gottlieb executive named Jill Pollack and investors Mondale Distributing were able to buy the pinball assets and name of Gottlieb, thus saving them and bringing them into a new company called Premier Technology. We'll have a look at that a little later too. But by September of 1984, the video game side of things was completely finished. Almost everyone who has been mentioned by name in this video to date was now on the hunt for another job, and naturally this meant that a bunch of games in the prototype stage were cancelled. Although again, this does give us a couple more titles to look at. While we have just covered the end of Mylstar, there are a few games that need attention from 1984, this brief period before it all came to a halt. 2 of them are released titles, and another 3 are unreleased. We'll start with the released games first. The least interesting of these 2 is Curveball, which is a pretty standard single-screen baseball game. Aside from the graphics and sound, there's not really a whole lot that separates this from the sort of baseball you would be able to play on the Atari 2600 or whatever. Really, the most intriguing thing about this is that it was designed and programmed by Bill Adams, who had previously been responsible for, among others, Schwann by Midway. It appears he was at Mylstar for a very brief time. Not much else to say, however. The second release title is more intriguing. When you think of the Three Stooges and games, you'll probably think of the Cinemaware title that was on computers and also the NES. That's kind of famous, or infamous depending on your point of view. But there is another one, and it is an arcade game. Here's the Three Stooges in Brides' Brides. Up to 3 players can pick either Larry, Curly or Moe, and the job is to use slaps, hammers and cream pies in order to find keys, deal with cops and other nuisances, and rescue your respective girlfriends from the mad scientist. Generally the keys are hidden inside everyday household objects, which must be smashed. And yes, there are plenty of voices kicking around. This one, I'm afraid, just isn't very good. It runs kind of shoddily and just feels rather bare, perhaps a little rushed out. Maybe this isn't surprising, as this is likely one of the last, if not the last, of the Mylstar games to receive any kind of release at all. Keith Smith's Forgotten Gottlieb's article says that Brides' Brides was the last of their games to be released in any kind of quantity. Not exactly the greatest of endings.
Hey, watch out! Hey, watch out!
The unreleased titles we can play do present some other ideas. First up, here's Tiles. This is a pretty good Qbert-esque game worked on by Chris Krull, where not only can you walk across the tiles, but you can also shoot them, as well as the medieval-themed enemies who'll try to stop you. The idea is to fill up the grid as much as possible, walking on spaces where there are no tiles in order to fill them, and then lighting them up with your shots. This still needs a little work. The sound in particular just consists of placeholders from Qbert, but the concept is actually very fun. Video Vince and the Arcade Factory is a very little known prototype. It's only really known that Chris Brewer, one of the programmers for Mach-3, was working on it. This title consists of minigames. First you have to capture the rogue game enemies and put them in cages, then you need to grab notes from your record player for the music, then you put an arcade machine together, and so on. It's also very meta, isn't it? Not the best of titles though. Again, a bit more polish could have helped matters here, but this game didn't get the chance. Finally, we have the best of these unreleased titles, Whiz Wars, which was also known as Arena. This was by Fred Darmstadt, who also worked on Mach-3, and you use a dial to move a wizard rapidly around a field of play, shooting at the monsters on the inside before they reach the walls of the arena and attack you. I really like this one. The gameplay is like a cartoonier and more diverse version of Tempest, and while it's obviously not as tight as that game, the extra little features are certainly cool to see. Apparently this game did reach testing, but wasn't popular there, and thus never had the chance to come out. A shame, as I do think it's quite neat. There are other names in the Gottlieb archives for games that are still totally missing in action, found on the old Unreleased Gottlieb games page. An ex-nuclear submarine man named Steve Pacheco worked on something called Jail Jumper, although not much is known about that game aside from the title. Lynn Oswald worked on a game where you had to lead ducks through various dangers. This may or may not be similar to another title called Bunnies, for which only a name exists. There's a vector game of some description, a game called Scout where you controlled a droid exploring a planet, another set around a volcano. Just very little tiny tidbits here and there. Hopefully the sort of thing that we'll see more of someday. The days of Mylstar may have ended, but there is enough here for a little postscript. Indeed, there's even still one more game to cover. As mentioned, Gottlieb's name and pinball assets were saved by a new company named Premier Technology, and these folks would continue to produce new tables under the name. A couple of these could be of interest to video game fans. In the early 90s, the Premier Gottlieb did produce 2 tables based on Super Mario Bros., as well as another table that was based on Street Fighter 2. Some other tables could also be of interest because of how blatant they are when it comes to being influenced by a more famous IP. Bad Girls is very similar in aesthetic to Michael Jackson's Bad, Deadly Weapon is quite a lot like Lethal Weapon, and so on. Still, all this meant that the Gottlieb name did keep rolling along as pinball exited the darker times of the early 80s, and then hit a resurgence in the early 90s with a whole load more innovation thanks to dot matrix displays, solid-state flippers, electronic launchers, and lots of just plain damn good machines in general. And then, in the midst of all of this, Premier Technology did try, just once, to have a crack at games, doing so with the help of Warren Davis, he of Q*bert fame. This result isn't necessarily the best game of them all, but it's most certainly one of the strangest arcade games that there's ever been. 1989's Exterminator is one of the first, if not the first arcade game ever, to be made entirely out of digitised graphics. Everything from the background to the enemies to the player itself started out as a photograph or a freeze frame. The concept itself is like a B-movie that's based around cleaning a house out of insects. You'd almost think it was a bit like the film Arachnophobia, although Exterminator predates it by a year. You play as this disembodied hand, and there's various things you can do to get rid of these pesky bugs. Most of the time you'll be flying around and grabbing the more generic flies that are kicking about, although be careful not to grab wasps. If you do, or if you keep the hand in one space for too long, they'll sting you. What you need to do with them is to shake the joystick to swat them away, and then go to the side of the screen, where you can make a finger gun and spray bug juice at the wasp and other critters. You use the rotary part of the joystick to control the direction of the spray from left to right, but again, you can only do this at your side of the screen, whether that's left or right. Finally, you can also pound the ground with your fist. This works for spiders, miniature tanks, and other enemies on the ground, although you need to be high enough to do it. Got all that? This is an incredibly odd game indeed. Honestly, there's very few if any arcade games that are even like it. Does that mean it's good? Yeah. I respect the total originality that's here in this game, but whether I find it fun to play is another matter. Personally, I think it's a right royal pain to play, but there you go. Creative as all get out, but it does feel quite frustrating. Exterminator was Premier Technology's only attempt at a game. It wasn't successful at all, not least because it was sold as a dedicated cabinet at a time when conversion kits were nearly entirely what operators were buying, and the game's custom hardware was very unreliable, breaking down frequently. And so, Premier just went back to pinball. Despite its general failure in the arcades, Exterminator did receive a bunch of home computer conversions. There were even versions for the age-old ZX Spectrum and C64, machines that had been around since the days when the old Gottlieb was still producing arcade titles. The whole story ends for good in the summer of 1996. Premier Technologies' final table was a license to one for the movie Barbed Wire, of all things, and not long afterwards the company closed its doors, right around the time that another golden age of pinball was coming to an end, marking the true finale of Gottlieb. Nowadays, most of the Gottlieb trademarks, at least on the pinball front, is at least held by a company bearing the name Gottlieb Development, while the video games still belong to Columbia, meaning that by extension they now belong to Sony, who bought the company in 1989. When Q*bert became a movie star in Wreck-It Ralph and also Pixels, Disney would have had to have gone to Columbia and Sony to actually get him. Naturally, the little orange creature has had a good life after Gottlieb in games too. There's been several other titles in the series, including another main sequel on the SNES, a PS1 game, and a rebooted title on Steam, PS4 and others, while a lot of Gottlieb's pinball history has been preserved, not just for official collections, but also through the fantastic work of fans recreating the tables in programs like Visual Pinball, something that has been absolutely fascinating to see and play over the course of making this video. With this, we've about reached the end of what's certainly been a rather epic tale. While this channel largely deals with video games, to cover Gottlieb and just look at their video games would hardly be telling the whole of its story. This was a significant company, a big name for decades, and one of the most unfortunate victims of the North American crash. And while we often use this crash to talk about how one certain company in particular pulled the region, or rather erroneously the world, out of it, it's important to also remember the things that were lost along the way. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and until the next time,
Bye bye.